I think the role of competition, whether it is between state governments or between industries, firms, whatever, I mean, is well recognized. The role of leadership. In fact, in my work on urbanization in the last 5 years, if there are two things that I can point to which really made all the difference, it wasn't finance, it was human leadership and technology. So again, we are not disagreeing. But let me come back to the point of what you call empowered mayors or directly elected mayors, because I think this is a very, very important point. This past June in Singapore, I was at a panel where the mayor of Chennai was sitting in the audience. And he stood up and made an intervention and surprised all the international gathering there by saying that he is a directly elected mayor, but he cannot ensure the delivery of the quantity or quality of water to the people who are in the Chennai, Greater Chennai area, because that is the responsibility of the water board, which is under the state government. And he seemed very frustrated and very constrained. So that's the point that I'm making. Yes, you, and in your terminology, it would mean empowering the mayor, or as you said, create space for competition. So what we are saying is that rather than just saying have directly elected mayors or give mayors power, you really need to fix that governance structure which strengthens their hands so that they are not merely held accountable, but they can deliver. You know, it's the how. How can they do it if they don't have control over the delivery of...
Would you agree that the only real mayor is the Chief Minister of Delhi?
You know, even that is not so. As you saw when Arvind Kejriwal was campaigning, he said that you know, police is not under the thing. So even the Delhi Chief Minister is not the real mayor. I agree. If you're going to redefine this to be have real mayors, then fix a whole lot of things and then say you have real. And that is a minor point, you know, that I was just like, the chair always has the last word. So with that, let me turn to Dr. Kathuria to propose the motion.
Thank you, Dr. Ahluwalia, for chairing this session so competently. I think it's been a very engaging discussion, and I must thank the Secretary in absentia, Dr. Gauri Kumar, for coming and lending meaning to the discussion that we had, and of course to Dr. Martin Rama and to Manish Sabharwal for taking the time off and being here with us today. I think a lot of this discussion will go on spill over into some of the technical sessions that will follow. The next session will begin at 2 o'clock, but before that we will have a lunch, so there'll be some food for thought there, and I'll encourage all of you to engage with one another, because this is work in, as Dr. Ahluwalia said, a lot of this is work in progress, and we are going to continue with this research over the course of the next year. One of the questions that got, I guess, missed, but is certainly an important part of this discussion, is what Mr. Nair raised, is while we are, you know, doing the reform, while we are fixing the plumbing, the governance, I think a part of the governance is enforcement, and I think that's what Mr. Nair was referring to improving the quality of our enforcement. So if you have self-certification, if you allow the firms to certify that they are complying with the rules, the quality of the enforcement will have to also correspondingly improve to get the compliance and get everyone to fall in line. The quality of the enforcement in India has suffered. So as Manish was saying, you know, a lot of this is now public good, the policy. We know what good policy is. We've got to get the how. And I just want to emphasize, when we talk about the how, I think we should also talk about governance to include the quality of the enforcement so that we get compliance all around. A lot of this discussion, as I said, will continue over the next couple of sessions. You're all invited. Please stay back for the sessions. There will be a special address at 6 o'clock by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, so you're invited for that, which will be followed for dinner. But meanwhile, thank you all for being here. and attending this session and contributing to the session. And let me especially thank the speakers. Once more, Gauri Kumar, Labour Secretary in absentia, Dr. Martin Rama, and Manish Sabharwal, and of course Dr. Ahluwalia for being here. Thank you all very much.
So, is that on? Yeah. So it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to introduce this session on youth unemployment. In India, like most of the other countries in the world, youth unemployment really is a key issue for all of us. If we cannot help youth get into sort of good jobs in the labour market, then we really are storing up problems for ourselves in the future, both in terms of social cohesion, but also in undermining potential growth in the future. So it really is important that we give youth a better start in the labour market. So it is a pleasure to have on this panel the very sort of distinguished experts. We have Professor Gunther Schmidt, who is the Director of the Labour Market Policy and Employment at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin for Social Forschung. We also have Dr. Neil O'Higgins, who is the Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Salerno, Italy. We have Professor Arup Mitra and Dr. Sher Verik. Arup Mitra is Professor of Economics at the Institute for Economic Growth in New Delhi, and Sher Verik is Senior Employment Specialist at the ILO Decent Work Team for South Asia, New Delhi. And as a discussant, we have Professor Alak Sharma, who is the Director at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. So we really have a fantastic panel. What I would like to do actually is just to set the scene for our discussion today, just giving you a brief overview of the youth labour market in G20 countries. I think this is a nice mixture comparing sort of performance of the youth in both the developing world but also in the developed world, and show that in some areas there is a lot of commonality in the issues that they are facing, even if the resources available to deal with the issues differ. Yeah. A5? F5, yeah. Yep. Yep, great. Thank God we've got somebody technologically present. So what I want to do is just first of all talk about labour market outcomes in youth and say that of course they go well beyond unemployment. I think in this session it's a bit of a misnomer just to talk about youth unemployment. Yes, there are a lot of young people unemployed, but our aim should not just be to sort of create more jobs for them, but also to create better jobs for them. Afterwards, I want to go through some of the obstacles. Why aren't we creating those jobs for young people? And then finally say that, of course, we do need comprehensive policies. And I think it was important this morning we talked about it's not just better employment policies, but we also have to be cross-disciplinary and also talk about education and training policies as well to help youth get into good jobs. So it's true, youth unemployment remains high in many countries, and we see particularly in the OECD countries, unemployment is still very high. That is a result of the crisis, but in some of these countries, youth unemployment has been high even before the crisis. We see in Spain, for example, youth unemployment rates of over 50%. Interestingly enough, we don't see such high unemployment rates in the developing countries or the emerging economies. We see lower rates in economies like Brazil and notably here in India, where it's around about 10%. South Africa actually stands out as one of the few emerging economies where you see significant numbers of unemployed young people. The reason for that is obvious, is because, of course, young people just cannot afford to be unemployed, and so they'll find some form of job, even if it's just a subsistence job. I think what we want to do actually is focus much more on this indicator of the proportion of young people that are not in school and not in employment. I think that's the group that we've got to look at, and perhaps gives a better indicator of the challenges that we face in many countries. And here we see, like in India, for example, that we've got close to 30% of young people aged 15 to 24 that are basically out of work and out of school. There's a gender dimension here, of course, because there's a lot of these young people are actually women. Now, in some cases, of course, that makes sense because they're young women looking after children, but nevertheless, I think a lot more has to be done to bring in these inactive people, young people, into work. And then we also have the issue that even if young people do find jobs, so they're not stuck in unemployment or inactivity, the quality of these jobs matters. And I think this is a key challenge across all of our countries. We see that, again, for OECD countries, the challenge, of course, is temporary jobs. So we see a high numbers, a high proportion of young people that get into jobs. That job is a temporary job. The problem is that would be fine if it was sort of a stepping stone to a permanent job. But what we've seen in our analysis at the OECD is that stepping stone simply doesn't work. Many of these young people get stuck in these jobs for long periods of time, or they alternate them with spells of unemployment. Moreover, they're not getting the training that they need. We see that people in temporary jobs get far less training than people in permanent jobs. So you have this tremendous labour market segmentation, and that affects particularly young people. On the right side, you'll see is the incidence of informal employment. So when we look at emerging economies, there the big issue is the high proportion of young people, higher than for adults, that are working in informal jobs where they have no social protection. Very high in India, over 80%, and very high in countries like Mexico, over 60%. So this is a key issue as well, not just getting young people into jobs, but getting them into better jobs where they do have social protection. Let me now get on to the obstacles, the job obstacles that are stopping them getting jobs. The first message to take away, of course, is the overall state of the economy. We see here that even before the crisis and now as a result of the crisis, youth unemployment basically follows more or less in line with overall unemployment. So across the OECD, we see that that ratio is about 2. So youth unemployment is roughly on average about twice as high as the overall unemployment. In some countries higher than that, some countries lower, but that ratio stays fairly constant over the economic cycle. So we've got to do better to improve the overall economy, and that will help youth back into jobs. The other message that also came out of this morning very strongly is a lack of basic skills. If young people do not have these foundation skills in literacy or numeracy, they will find it hard getting into jobs, and when they get into jobs, they will be very low-paid, informal or precarious jobs. This shows you the proportion of 15-year-old students that score at level 1 on the reading scale in the PISA survey of students that is run internationally across countries. And you see that in some of the Indian states, unfortunately we do not have a representative sample for all of India, but in the few Indian states that we've looked at, you've got rates of 80 or 90% of young people without these basic foundation skills. That's quite high also in Indonesia and Brazil, but you'll see that in some of these, few of the major cities in China, much, much lower. Very, very few young people leave school without these foundation skills. Of course, it's not just having the foundation skills, but having the skills that employers need in the labour market. And we see that in a lot of both OECD countries, but also emerging economies, there's a tremendous problem of skills mismatch, where young people, even if they go on to higher education, do not have the qualifications that employers want and often end up overqualified for their job, or we have employers complaining that they can't find young people with the skills they need. And we see here, this is a survey of employers, and it's the proportion of employers saying that they can't find people with the skills needed for the jobs that they have on offer. And we see that proportion has sort of risen quite dramatically in India, and 60% of firms were reporting they couldn't find young people with the skills that they needed. Of course, there's a lot of big question marks about this data. Take it with a huge sack of salt, because it's not necessarily representative of all employers, and particularly in countries like India, where there are huge numbers of very, very small employers. The other issue, of course, is high labor costs. Now, of course, we need to have a balance. Young people need to have good incomes in work. But if those labor costs are excessive, either because the basic minimum wage that is imposed on employers is too high, or because non-wage costs are very high, that can actually stop employers taking on young, inexperienced workers. And again, we see large differences across countries. So at the OECD, we are in favor of a minimum wage. There should be a wage floor guaranteeing decent wages, but we have to be careful not to price young people out of work. And we see that in many countries, like in Brazil, minimum wages still look fairly low compared to average wages, so just over 30% of average wages, but quite high in Indonesia at over 60%. We talked about this also this morning, about strict employment protection rules and excessive labour market regulation, which can be a barrier to employment. Again, it's about getting the balance right. You do need labour market regulation, you do need these employment protection rules, but when they're too strict, you are protecting a small group of people in permanent jobs, and that means very precarious labour market segmentation for young people that can't get into these permanent jobs. They're locked out of them, and they'll either be in temporary jobs or in informal jobs. So there has to be an appropriate balance. What you don't want, which some OECD countries did, was deregulate temporary jobs, so making it easier to hire on temporary jobs, and keep that protection very strict of permanent jobs. Then you're guaranteed to end up with strong labour market segmentation. So we argue at the OECD that, of course, taking into account those skills deficits, those labour market regulation issues, the unemployment needs of young people in terms of needing some sort of income support if they are unemployed, this means that you need to take a comprehensive approach to dealing with youth unemployment and helping young people get into decent jobs. So we've broken that down into two pillars under our OECD Youth Action Plan. One is to tackle the current youth unemployment crisis, and the second one is to actually take a longer-term view, so tackling some of those structural issues. So this needs measures on the one hand to boost aggregate growth, that's absolutely important, but also where we need those labour market measures that can help the unemployed people find a job, and to tackle those demand-side barriers such as high labour costs that are stopping employers taking on low-skilled youth. Then in the longer term, you have to improve the education system, create better links between the education system and the world of work, and basically reshape your labour market institutions more generally to make job creation stronger and to overcome these barriers stopping young people moving into work. I won't go through quality apprenticeships, but clearly this is one key area that's very important. We have to get back to promoting vocational education and training. This is a key area that many OECD countries made the mistake of letting the vocational education and training sector sort of go into sort of terminal decline and promoted just higher education, university education. This is something that emerging economies need to sort of avoid. They need to have a vibrant vocational education and training sector. So I won't go through that in the interest of time, and I'll just finish off by saying I think what we do need to do is to sort of not just have good words and good rhetoric on what we should be doing, but let us set some ambitious goals, whether it's internationally through the G20, whether it's at the OECD, or whether it's at the national level, like here in India, or even at the local or state level. Let us set some goals for our policies, and then let's see how well our policies are moving us towards those goals. So I've put up a few suggested goals here. namely both on the education side and on the labor side. So I think, again, making sure young people have the right skills for the labor market, lowering unemployment and this NEET rate, and creating better opportunities for continuous education and training, and tackling labor market informality in particular. And lastly, the last point is to say there is also a very strong gender dimension here. We really need to help young women get into the labor market. Otherwise, we really are missing that demographic dividend. We'll only achieve half of that demographic dividend if we do not get young women also into the labor market. I think it's a tremendous challenge here in India, but if we can get both young women into the labor market as well as young men, we will be actually improving chances to have much stronger, more inclusive growth for everybody. Thank you. Let me now turn over straight away to the next speaker, Professor Gunther Schmidt, who will be telling us about the youth labour market in India, but in the perspective of what's going on in the European Union. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear organizers, thank you so much for this invitation. It gives me the opportunity to visit the first time India, the first time in my life. Maybe in India I would have to say the first time in the life. A few years ago I discovered at some airport The White Tiger, a book by Aravind Adiga, for which he got the main Booker Prize. The plot of this novel is about a young Indian boy who left school early and eventually became a successful entrepreneur by killing his boss. This is probably not the model you expect from me as a solution of youth unemployment in India. So what can I bring from Europe? And why can India learn from Europe? We all face the same moral obligation. Paul Krugman put it in a nutshell. A merchant may sell many things, but a worker usually has only one job, which supplies not only his livelihood, but often much of his sense of identity. An unsold commodity is a nuisance, an unemployed worker a tragedy. We pondered briefly about the theory of the job in the morning, and I would argue that one basic element of a job is identity. What can you best, and maybe even better than other people? This is an important element of a job, not necessarily of employment. India and Europe face the same problem: high youth unemployment, the danger of a lost generation. Jean-Claude Juncker, the current president of the European Commission, put all this in a nutshell. Europe has not 28, but 29 countries. Number 29 are the youth, our lost country. So we may face the same problems, India and Europe, but for different reasons. And this is a chance for mutual learning. And I will structure my intervention by the presentation of 6 questions, trying to ask 6 questions. What are the differences? What are the causes? What are the main strategies? What are the immediate measures? What are the lessons from Europe? And what is the broader picture at the end? And so let's start with the differences. By conventional statistics, the differences of youth unemployment rates within Europe are larger than between Europe and India. Germany is with 77%, one of the few European countries outperforming India's youth unemployment rate of 11%. Switzerland is a champion with 3.4%, and Greece holds the red lantern with almost 60% youth unemployment rate. Imagine. But it's statistics, stupid. Through the looking glass, you can simply turn things around. According to need, which means youth neither in employment, nor in education, nor in training. The youth rate, the need rate in India is roughly estimated. There are no exact estimates in India, roughly 28%. In Europe, it's only 15%. Germany looks not anymore so favorable. The Netherlands are now the champion with 6.2%, and only Turkey looks worse than India. However, differences that really matter are the following. Young women face relatively more unemployment in India than men, which is not the case necessarily in Europe. Relative youth unemployment is much higher than adult unemployment. High-skilled have higher unemployment risk than low-skilled. And last but not least, 1 out of 4 is neither in employment nor in education or training, whereas in Germany it is just 1 out of 10. What are the causes? Let me start with a very, very simple model, causal framework, by following the advice of Nobel laureate Bob Solow, who once said, fine distinctions make bad policy. So, without fine distinctions, youth needs more and better jobs. Anything has to be done to support job creation, complemented by sensible job maintenance, flexible jobs, and work sharing in case of the ups and downs of the economy. Youth needs the right skills. Anything has to be done to rise the learning capacities and to complement this by dual learning systems that combine learning with working and earning. And youth needs the right governance. Anything has to be done to foster cooperative industrial relations and fair risk sharing to ensure quality standards and to fight against discrimination. Before we go into the details of these strategies, let me confront you with some stylized facts about the causes of need from recent econometric research. You will find the main factors that rise the need rates in Europe are lack of GDP growth, lack of stabilizers, and employment protection to some extent, but I put it in brackets because I will show you later why you have to deal with this issue very carefully, and Mark has already pointed to this point. But I will make it more illustrative. So let me come to the first strategy. Youth needs more and better jobs. The main reasons for the lack of jobs can briefly be enumerated. First, recessions disadvantaging youth, in particular through the last in, first out rule. A common measure is Okun's coefficient, which expresses the elasticity of unemployment related to economic growth. In Spain, for example, 1% decline in GDP growth increases the youth unemployment rate by 2 percentage points. A recent study by IMF found that about 50% of the increase in European youth unemployment is explained by cyclical factors, in the Eurozone even by 70%. So it's a lack of growth. Other more structural reasons for the lack of jobs are financial speculations instead of investing into real jobs, excessive wage volatilities and wage inequalities, and investment into the most profitable sectors instead investment also in public goods, public infrastructure, social infrastructure. I will come back to this point, which is so important. It's not only manufacturing. It is creating jobs for social infrastructure, public infrastructure of various arts. What are the promising policy strategies? Due to time limitations, I can only enumerate more or less the possible instruments. And it must be emphasized that these possibilities are not alternatives, but complementary measures. The first strategy is to smooth recessions through deficit spending and preferably through automatic stabilizers. Various studies found that youth unemployment has been effectively prevented to some extent through maintaining effective demand, of purchasing power through welfare entitlements like unemployment, health, disability, and pension insurance. Furthermore, Switzerland, the champion in youth unemployment, is one of the few countries that also implement active labor market policy in an anti-cyclical way. in particular by training measures and employment subsidies. The most important structural policy is to control financial markets in order to ensure real instead of speculative investments. Active industry policy targeted to small and medium-sized enterprises is another important instrument. And here I can a little bit relate to the discussion in the morning. I think it's not only manufacturing which is a driver of job creation, it's also more and more even intelligent services in forms of financial services, in form of research and development, in form of information and communication technologies, real estate management. International law, for instance, is so important for medium-sized firms that they can export goods to be able to reflect international laws and things like that. So most jobs are created in Europe, especially in Germany, in the area not in manufacturing itself, but in business-oriented, production-oriented services. And the second larger driver is health insurance, social insurance, education, and things like that. And I think even India might exploit its comparative advantage in information and communication technology to start to export education as a good. It's not only manufacturing, also education. Look at Australia. Mark, you know it better than me. After minerals and things like that, the education sector is the largest exporting sector in Australia. So think about this in India. You may have chances in this respect too. And we can put a little bit more in the discussion emphasis. What are the elements of industrial policy? So also good governance, which has been emphasized by Martin Rana in the morning. So youth needs the right skills. The main reasons for the lack of skills or misguided skills are, first of all, too low investment into human and social capital. Second, asymmetric investment, for instance, academic inflation, which fosters credentialism. Third, too narrow investments into job-specific skills with high risk of unemployment. Fourth, skill mismatch due to information asymmetries and lack of trust. The first policy strategy, of course, is investing into education, not only at a sufficient level, but also with an inclusive aim. I think both Europe and India still are confronted with a tremendous challenge to include all young people, independent of their social background, into high-quality general education. That means developing learning capacities not only to make young people fit for the market, but also to enable young people to raise their voice and to shape the market. The second policy strategy is to enhance general learning capacities through the establishment of dual learning systems, according to the theory of transitional labor markets. Because most of you may not be familiar with this concept, I briefly introduce it in this way. The main point of transitional labor markets framework is to consider labor market policy as a task of managing social risk over the life course through a system of employment insurance. There are 5 main risks with which we have to cope during the life course: the lack of earning capacities, which makes youth unemployable; volatile or too low earnings; no earnings at all due to unemployment; restricted earnings capacity due to the family or other social obligations; reduced earnings capacities due to disability or old age. Modern societies have established for each of these risks some kind of insurance mechanism, and here we deal with, in particular, with the risk of unemployability and unemployment itself. So we are talking about development. It has been asked in the morning, what is the relationship to development? And one of the key hypotheses and arguments of my talk is that for development, having a good overall and general system of social protection and social security is a key for development. It's really key. Related to the risk over the life course, the first risk I already hinted to the need of investing into general education at a sufficient level and with inclusive aim, especially into competences like reading, mathematics, communication skills, learning abilities, and secondary virtues like endurance and ambiguity tolerance. A high level of general learning capacities is the best insurance against all other social risks occurring during the life course. Second, managing the risk of unemployability cannot only consist in providing high levels of formal education. Education has to be related to market needs, which means to the skills required to produce the goods and to deliver the services that consumers demand. The TLM concept success to establish and to enhance dual learning systems, so the combination of learning, working, earning, and identity building. Through the combination of job-specific and general skills, the reduction of information asymmetries by voice and trust, and finally, through fair risk sharing of costs and benefits related to the investment. You find more detailed elaboration of these arguments in a paper I've written for the conference, which will be available later on, I think, or you can load it down as a PDF file. Youth needs good governance. The main reasons for bad governance are hostile industrial relations, neglect of cooperation, no or unfair risk sharing, all kinds of monopolies, for example, employment protection for job keepers, the insiders of the labor market. What are the promising strategies of good governance? I have enumerated here some examples. First, fostering social partnership, for instance, through acknowledging or extending collective agreements and wage coordination. Second, encourage cooperation between firms and schools, colleges or universities to improve coordination between the labor market and the education system. Third, enhance dual education systems as devices for fair risk sharing between employers, the workers, and the state. Fair risk sharing is so important and very often neglected. Fourth, fight monopolies, for example, the unconditional employment protection of labor market insiders. So I come to the point, be careful. Not all employment protection reflects bad governance. There are good reasons for providing some protections to workers, in particular with regard to mutual investments of employers and employees into human and social capital. If there is no protection at all, both parties will not invest into vocational education and training because they are not assured of the returns of investment. The principle of fair risk sharing requires some security in this respect, and moderate and conditional employment protection is just doing this job. Let me demonstrate this by some stylized facts. This figure depicts on the vertical lines 4 indicators of youth unemployment. Unemployment rates, need rates, youth unemployment relative to adults, and the relative share of youth unemployment. The horizontal axis is the time axis from 1990 to 2010. The OECD countries are grouped into 3 categories. Those without dual systems, those with partly dual systems, and those with full employment, full developed dual systems. On all indicators, the dual systems perform best. Now at first glance, you see on this picture the relationship of employment protection and relative youth unemployment rates for all OECD countries in 20 years. You see a positive correlation, employment protection, the higher employment protection, the higher youth unemployment on the average. But if you, on second glance, however, you see that this positive correlation holds only true for OECD countries with no dual systems at all. OECD countries with partly and particular OECD countries with fully developed dual training systems have lower relative youth unemployment rate despite high employment protection. We may discuss about this. So the main lesson from this exercise is quite clear. Employment protection is not detrimental to youth employment if it's connected with mutual human and social capital investments of employers and employees in form of dual learning systems. Again, you find more in my paper. And the next slides I will skip and come to the last point. The future of youth unemployment. It's of course hard to predict, especially for the future, so to speak. But one thing is sure, because the decisions have already been made about demography, So the children are here and growing up. In Europe, the problem may be easing due to demographic reasons, but we will have more the challenge of skill deficits. But in India, it's probably worsening because you have this that tremendous dynamic which has been alluded many times in the morning already. And for this demographic dividend, you have in India job creation is of course the primary task for both. So is higher education, and this is the last point, is the higher education the solution? To some extent, yes, but with a big but in big letters. Europe, in my view, is a warning signal to India. Many European countries have a serious problem of overqualification or a kind of academic inflation. This is tremendously costly and especially unjust because such a situation fosters the allocation of jobs according to the formal credentials and not according to the abilities and performance. From my reading experience, India faces a problem of overqualification too. A recent article in New York Times put it in a nutshell too. Education in India is a paradox. India's scientists and engineers are dominant in global technology, medicine and other fields. Yet 40% of its third graders can't read words, 40%. I was pondering about this paradox. The result of my reflections is a hypothesis which may sound provocative. Could it be that behind this paradox lies an insurance motive? As a matter of fact, high formal qualification is still the best device to end up in a high-paid job with high social security and high employment protections. This holds especially true when social security is in terms of unemployment, health, disability and pension insurance is underdeveloped or even totally missing. In such a situation, it is fully rational if those who can afford it aspire to get the best formal and higher education. Social and economic incentives to aspire vocational training at the middle level are low. So the solution would be to follow the wise words by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. As for the future, our task is not to foresee it, but to enable it. So the main lessons again and summarized for both Europe and India would be mind to open the doors of decent general education to all children, mind to extend dual learning systems at the middle, but also at the higher level, and last but not least, mind to tighten the social security net for risks beyond unemployment, and this is so important for development. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gunther. I think there were a lot of important points there. I take away very much your message about transitional labor markets, and what's important is really to create systems about that give us employment insurance. So employment insurance over the life cycle, making sure that people are employable over the life cycle, and that starts very early, and sort of good general education is the key to that. That's the foundation stone that we build the rest of the system on. Let me now ask Neil O'Higgins to come to the floor, to take the floor, and he will give you an overview of labour markets in the European countries, and I think particularly showing that there's a lot of diversity even within these countries, and some countries are doing better than others, and hopefully he will give us the reasons for why. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. For me too, it's my first time here, and I felt that it was not appropriate to enter into discussions of the Indian situation directly, but I will try and talk a little bit about the broader global situation as regards youth unemployment and youth non-employment more generally. I'd like to start saying what I'm going to try and do. I would like to begin with some definitional issues and talk a little about the problem. It's already been covered to some extent. This ground has already been covered today, so I'll do that quickly. Then look briefly at some of the consequences of youth unemployment, or more broadly non-employment, NEET, as we have heard already. I'll mention what happened to youth labour markets, particularly in Europe during the recent recession, the ongoing recession, perhaps I should say. I'll discuss also some of the causes of youth unemployment, and as with the other presenters, I would emphasize the role of aggregate demand, the general state of the economy, but note that institutions also are important. I'll say a few words about what to do about it and end up with some concluding remarks. The paper is presentation is quite broad, so hopefully it will be also informative. First of all, we haven't discussed this so far. Who are young people? What do we mean by young people? Well, I mean, there's some discussion about that, but there's a standard international definition which runs from age 15 to age 24. The sense of this definition is to start with more or less minimum school leaving age and end up with a point in time when people have completed their education. So what it is this period of youth is a period of transition. By definition, it's a period of transition from childhood to adulthood, and a transition from school to employment. Of course, not everybody in all countries goes to school in the first place, but if we start from that point of view, so that's the basic sense. When I talk about adults in this, later on in the presentation, I'm referring to so-called prime age adults. That's between generally 25 and 50 or so. Okay, so that's first point. Unemployment. Okay, so to be unemployed, this has already been mentioned, but let me just emphasize because it becomes important later. To be unemployed, a person needs to be without work, currently available work, and actively seeking work. Now, a lot of countries, this actively seeking work may or may not be terribly relevant. Is that the problem in India? The youth unemployment rate is about 10%. It is about 5 times the rate of adults, but I would argue that India, the problem of youth unemployment is really not the main point at all. But I'll come to that. So anyway, unemployment in the first place is a rather restrictive definition. Because it talks only about those people actively seeking work, it ignores the discouraged. And indeed, I tend to prefer what I used to call, I still, I'm afraid, do call the jobless rate, but what is more commonly known as the NEET rate. That is all young people who are neither in employment nor in full-time education or some form of educational training. Secondly, it doesn't necessarily give an accurate idea of the size and nature of youth transition problems. As I mentioned, youth unemployment rate in India is 10%, but actually there's a lot more young people in India who are involved in low-quality informal sector employment and such like. And the youth unemployment rate can be very high, for example, in European countries where a large proportion of the youth population is in education. Very often you can have a high youth unemployment rate, but it doesn't actually affect very many people. It's those people who are not in education who are actively seeking work. And finally, I'd say that the duration of unemployment is also of particular significance. It's much more important than the unemployment per se. The point about the transition, youth being a period of transition, is a time of change. People try out different things. Youth unemployment affects more or less all young people to a greater or lesser extent. The problem really emerges when that unemployment, state of unemployment becomes stabilized as a sort of natural state. It becomes much harder to get out of it. And of course, there's also the question of job quality. In countries with little or no social protection, of course, young people are more or less forced to find some survival strategy, unless they have a family behind them who can support them while they enjoy the luxury of looking for work. And so issues of underemployment and vulnerable employment are particularly important. In higher income countries, as I think Gunther mentioned, there's also, Mark, there's an emerging issue of temporary and part-time work, atypical forms of employment amongst young people, which again, the problem is if this situation becomes established as a general pattern and creates a sort of permanent instability in youth labour markets. What are the consequences? Well, in the first place, for society, as the World Bank pointed out in its excellent report on youth some 10 years ago, youth unemployment represents a potential output loss for society as a whole, and of course it represents income loss for the young people themselves. This is equally true or similarly true for young people in very low quality forms of employment, of course. It's associated, particularly in the high-income countries, with higher crime and antisocial behaviour, and as well with ill health and ill health, both physical and psychological. But perhaps most importantly is the issue of scarring, what I touched upon before. Unemployment now amongst young people has long-term consequences for young people as they go through their lifetime, and that's the real point, that's the real danger. A significant period of unemployment early on in life damages young people's capacity to earn and to find work later on in life, and that's been established. Unfortunately, the kind of data requirements you need to establish that, let's say, in a systematic manner aren't readily available. So it's based on industrialized countries or high-income countries, but certainly that seems to be the case. So the negative consequences tend to increase more than proportionally with the time spent without work. So let's have a look quickly at what happened during the recession. Well, on the left-hand side, we have the percentage change in youth unemployment rates in EU countries, youth and adult unemployment rates, the left-hand bars. And we can actually see that, the contrary to what has been said, youth unemployment rates actually increased proportionately less than adult unemployment rates in EU countries. That's not really the problem. In fact, the ratio of youth to adult unemployment rates fell. Youth employment, on the other hand, fell much more than adult employment rates, the second group of figures. But really the problems emerge when we look at the right-hand side of the graph. In particular, the prevalence of long-term unemployment, the red bar and the yellow bar beside in the middle. I think if I can find I've got a pointer here. If that works, no, that can't. Okay. The bar in the middle, LT unemployment, that is long-term unemployment amongst young people and adults, the change over the recession period. And one can see that it got much worse for young people, and that's where the real problem lies. Similarly for temporary employment, that increased more than for adults, but there are two factors at work. On the one hand, during the recession, temporary employment increased amongst young people. On the other hand, because people who are in temporary employment are easier to fire, this counteracted the overall positive increase. And then you can see that also part-time employment increased. Okay? But really, the main point I want to make is that it's really long-term employment, the blue line here, that was the problem associated with the recession. Amongst young people, long-term employment increased and continues to increase, whereas now youth unemployment rates themselves are leveling off. The prevalence of long-term unemployment amongst young people continues to increase rapidly. Indeed, now in EU countries, we've introduced Youth Guarantee, which is precisely designed to counteract long-term youth unemployment. But what about the rest of the world? Well, if we look at what's going on in the world as a whole, I divided the world, as the ILO conveniently did on its website, into two bits: so-called developed economies, which basically means OECD, and the rest of the world, so the lower middle income countries. If one looks, the red bar again shows the percentage change in youth unemployment between 2007 and 2013. The yellow bar shows the corresponding change in adults, and the sort of orangey brown bar, it looks orange on my screen, but it's kind of brown here, shows the overall picture. The general thing is that, as I noted before, youth unemployment actually increased less than adult unemployment during the recession. But if we look at the rest of the world, that is the greater part of the world, find that actually increased rather little, and it was much more adult unemployment that increased during this period. I hasten to add that, of course, during this period, much of the world wasn't really undergoing a recession in the same way that the higher income countries were, as several commentators pointed out. The other point about that I would like to point out is if we look at unemployment and so-called vulnerable employment, that's own account workers plus family workers, what you find is that whereas in OECD countries, developed economies, so-called developed economies, unemployment is a problem more or less on a par with vulnerable employment. If we look at the rest of the world, we find that actually unemployment is a problem which is much, much smaller dimension compared to vulnerable employment. Really, we're talking about, as I think someone mentioned this morning, this is, I'm afraid, not for young people themselves, but for the whole population. We're talking about unemployment increased to about 200 million in the world as a whole. But vulnerable employment affects about 1.5 billion people in the world. So really, we're talking about whole different dimensions. So the problem really is much more than just youth unemployment. So what causes, let's say more generally, youth non-employment or difficulties in youth? Okay, we've been through a lot of this already, so I would just re-emphasize that every study that's ever looked at this issue has found a strong role for aggregate demand. So it's the strength of the economy as a whole, which is a key factor in determining youth entry into the labour market. But of course, that's not the whole story. Institutions matter. What about the size of the youth cohort, the youth population? We haven't really mentioned that yet. Or wages. Well, that has been spoken about. I'll say something about that now, and also employment protection legislation. I won't say anything about skills and experience. That's been very well dealt with already. So I'll take it as read that the German and other countries operating a dual system represent a sort of ideal. But the question remains about how easy it is to transfer such systems to other countries. In any case, if we look at what happened in the EU during the recession, there's a strong positive relationship between GDP change, change in national income, if you like, and change in youth employment. There's this clear positive relationship. GDP fell, youth employment fell, okay? But there's a lot of variation across countries. These are all different countries, and as you can see, there's a lot of big scatter around the line itself. So that's in the way of making the point, GDP matters, aggregate demand matters, but it's not the whole story. What about youth population? Well, youth population, well, in the first place, as a whole, in the world, the youth population is falling as a percentage of the working age population. And this is a trend, a general trend which is operating more or less everywhere. There are different countries. In India, there are a number of countries where the youth population hasn't yet reached a peak, but in general, the tendency is downward. Secondly, the evidence that a large youth cohort actually damages youth employment prospects is not at all proven. It's not the econometric evidence on this is rather mixed, and it's certainly not. There's no reason to think that necessarily a larger youth population leads to larger youth unemployment. It's, as Kofi Annan some years ago pointed out, a large youth population is an opportunity, not just a problem. It's not just a question we have to find, but there are a number of reasons why a dynamic youth population can facilitate growth, can be good for the economy, and hence not be a problem. What about oh, okay. So, minimum wages, very quickly. Minimum wages, the evidence that minimum wages, high minimum wages causes youth unemployment is mixed. Real point here is that the effect is probably negative, but it's rather small. And there are other beneficial effects of minimum wages. Above all here, I would say that there are clearly interactions between different institutions in the labour market, and we don't know enough about these. We can say things about them, but we don't know enough about them. And really, so it's not that minimum wages necessarily harm, damage, or necessarily don't damage youth unemployment. It depends. And the same could be true with employment protection legislation. While it's clear that employment protection legislation reduces hires and reduces fires, it doesn't actually say anything about what the overall effect on youth unemployment. And there are different results, and the likelihood is that what is clear is that during the recession, countries with strong employment protection were damaged, young people were damaged less than in countries, more flexible countries. That's absolutely clear. I would say that more, and one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet though, on the other hand, there's sort of varied findings on wages, on minimum wages, and on employment protection. The picture regarding the tax wedge, that is the gap between wages received by workers and wages and labour costs paid by employers, is clearly it's one of the few variables which is consistently found to have a strong positive impact on youth unemployment. So the bigger the tax wedge, the worse the situation for young people. What to do about it? Well, I won't say very much about that. I would be wholeheartedly with Gunther Schmidt in saying that really what you need is or the ideal way of treating